eccentric lecture of mine that actually all birds were warm-blooded reptiles with feathers. And on the basis of that rather tenuous biological factoid, I hope you'll believe that I am justified in being in the programme, and I shall proceed. I'm going to talk to you about some work we've done on evaluating the effects of mitigating the impacts of development on reptiles and amphibians. And the species that I'm mainly interested in are what we call the widespread species. So in terms of the reptiles, we have the grass snake. Where have I gone? I've jumped into my report somewhere. There we go. So we have the grass snake, the adder, the Emeritus lizard, and the slow worm. We have other rare reptiles that are much less widespread. They also come into conflict with development, but on a much less widespread basis. So I'm mainly going to talk about these. Now, there's a whole swathe of legislation, legal instruments, and policy and planning that affect these species. But I'm really going to sort of synthesise that by saying that really these widespread reptiles, it boils down to them having protection, full protection against being killed or injured, and also being traded commercially. But the protection for the habitats they live in is rather limited. If they're on treble SI, or if there's some planning guidance that protects them, then that may afford some habitat protection. But otherwise, their habitats have rather little protection. The other one that has a higher degree of protection that is widespread is the great crested newt. So this has a slightly higher level in that it is also protected as a species against killing and injuring and also capture, but also this species has a degree of protection for its habitat. It is an offence to deliberately or recklessly disturb the species or the habitat that it lives in. So what this boils down to is that because they're widespread, this results in a lot of conflict with development, because if these species crop up on development sites, then something has to be done to mitigate the effects of these developments. And this can result in publicity which is not always good. And one of our recent prime ministers, you may recall, said that counting newts was an impediment to housing within this country, propagating this sort of slightly naive and I think inaccurate idea that development and conservation are two separate things and it's a choice between one and the other. There has been guidance produced for great crested newts, but it's not very up to date. The last guidance is this one on the right here, produced by English Nature over 20 years ago in 2001. It hasn't been updated since then. There's lots of useful information in there, but in the last 20 years we've learnt a lot. And it really, one of the shortfalls is that we are not using up-to-date evidence in carrying out this. For reptiles, there's pretty much no guidance at all, or very generic guidance that isn't very helpful. So what traditional mitigation practice in the UK involves? Well, theoretically it involves employing the mitigation hierarchy. You start off, you say, is there any way of avoiding the impacts of this development? If we can't avoid it, can we minimise it? Can we reduce it? If we can't do that, can we restore habitat and species? And last resort is offsetting, where if there is any damage occurring, then say, well, okay, we can't really do very much at this site, we're going to try and offset it by doing something somewhere else. Another issue here is that mitigation translocations are driven by supply rather than demand. And this is a real fundamental conservation issue. They are driven by the fact that we have some animals and they're in a place that is rather inconvenient, where development needs to happen. And therefore, those animals need to go somewhere else, or something needs to be done to try and mitigate that impact on those animals. Demand is really where it's driven by conservation. That's when we sort of start with a blank sheet and say, we have a nice habitat here, let's use proper conservation principles to work out what is realistically to put there, how many we need to do it, and how we design it, rather than doing some sort of almost emergency removal of animals from the site. The other issue here is that the outcomes, traditionally, I would say, have been measured against legal and regulatory targets rather than ecological targets. I'm very familiar with nice stories on local news or in local newspapers of a CEO of a development company with his high-vis jacket and his helmet on holding a lizard or a slow worm and saying, we've managed to translocate several hundred of these animals to another wonderful home. Isn't that great? It's a good example of partnership and sustainable development. Wonderful example of really possibly unsustainable development. Because I think the reality is that isn't the end of the project. From an ecological perspective, that is the start. As an ecologist, I'm interested in what's happening to the populations that are founded, if they are founded, by those animals and subsequently moved. Just as a quick example, I first got interested in development mitigation here in Canterbury back in the early 90s, and this was a project that happened not very far from here at a place called Bus Company Island, which is right in the middle of Canterbury, and it involved the translocation of some slow worms from the site of Pine Tree Avenue, just below where the university is, down here to Bus Company Island, which is slap bang in the middle of Canterbury. And this was carried out by a PhD student called Renata Plattenberg, and was quite a pioneering study at the time because it was really pretty much the first one where there'd been any science done on it. Bus Company Island, literally, if there's anyone good at cricket, if you went outside the front here and lobbed a stone in that direction, there would be a good chance that you might hit a hibernating slow worm on Bus Company Island, as you can see where the cathedral is. It's a very nice translocation site because it's surrounded by water, and it was restored very sympathetically by Canterbury City Council to be a receptor site. So what Renata did was go out to Pine Tree Avenue and remove animals on once or twice a day from July right up to October. And this graph just shows the number of animals that were removed on each of those dates. And I think you can see towards the end of the study in October, we were catching almost just as many slow worms as we were at the beginning. This survey was done by putting out metal sheets, these nice little sort of heat shields that attract animals to them, as well as sort of walking around and picking up any animals that you find. But the ACO, the artificial cover object approach, is very good for slow worms. They do use them very readily. So although animals were being taken off this site on a daily basis, it didn't seem to dent the population whatsoever. And over this period, there were 103 slow worms removed during 75 surveys, which is way beyond conventional mitigation practice. But ultimately, and even when we analysed this properly using statistics, there was no impact on the donor population. So after October, the developer said, right, time's up, we've got to move in with the bulldozers. And I hate to think how many slow worms were left behind there to go under the bulldozers. So what we have here is something I think we call the iceberg effect. Here we have an iceberg, and on the other side we've got a nice little cover object with a lizard hiding under it, so it might be a sheet of tin. And when we come to do these mitigation exercises, effectively, we're just really removing the tip of the iceberg, because these animals, we don't really know how long they're using these cover objects for, these pieces of tin, and they probably cycle between them. And I think part of the problem is that there isn't really any guidance about the proportion of the population you need to move, or anything to do with sort of whether you are actually having impact on that population. And I suspect that in many, many mitigation instances, the vast majority of the animals are left behind to go under the bulldozers. But you are still satisfying your legal obligations here, because it just involves taking all the left. Following this up, another PhD student called Darrell Nash, we decided to have a look at this across a number of sites and to try and evaluate the success of reptile mitigations. And what we did was Darren managed to contact 6 friendly ecological consultants that were doing translocations right across southern Britain, from down here in Kent to South Wales. And these were monitored for 1 to 3 years. And what we did here was we did a deal with the consultants that they carried out the translocation, but one extra thing we wanted them to do was to photograph the heads and the body patterns of all the animals that were moved, so we could individually identify them at a later date. And then the deal was that we would come in and do the follow-up surveys, and there were between 4 to 31 surveys done per site. And again, this combined what we call direct visual cover object surveys. This is an example of some of the results from those 6 sites. So I'll just call them site A, B and C. These are 3 sites where just the viviparous lizards were translocated, and there was over 100 lizards translocated from each of these sites. Over the subsequent surveys, we didn't get a single recapture of any of those animals that had been moved. There were some issues with these sites. This site A was subject to flooding, which might have affected things. And interestingly, site B, we did get some young lizards, so we thought it was possible that possibly the females we moved then gave birth and then disappeared. And site C was even more interesting because the consultants had told us that they'd actually surveyed this receptor site and there were no reptiles there. But when we surveyed it, we did find reptiles, but they weren't the ones that had been translocated. They were different individuals. So we're not sure whether that was down to inadequate survey before the translocation, or possibly that site was colonised after the translocation. But whatever happened, it looked quite likely that none of the translocated animals remained there. Site D, there was lizards, slow worms and grass snakes, 45 animals, only slow worms, 4 slow worms were recaptured there. Site E was viviparous lizards and slow worms, and over 100 animals moved, just 2 slow worms and 1 lizard recaptured. And site F was an adder translocation where 45 adders were translocated into an area where there were existing adders, which in some ways is a terribly good idea, but it does go on. And although we got 16 resident adders, we only got 2 of the ones that had actually been translocated there. So what's going on here? Well, there's a number of possibilities. First of all, is it that when you release these animals, they just disperse from the site? Secondly, do they die? Or thirdly, are they there and you just don't see them? Well, we're not entirely sure. It might be a combination of all of these things, but we have some evidence that dispersal from the release site is actually going on. And just going back to the adders that I was talking about a minute ago, we did actually put radio transmitters on some of those translocated adders. And what we found here was that the female adders, when you moved those, they tend to be fairly happy with being moved and would sit tight. But we had 3 male adders, all of which totally dispersed from the receptor site. And 2 of those male adders went straight back to the site where they'd actually been collected from due to development. And there's evidence from other species in other parts of the world that this dispersal issue can be quite an important one. What about the other species, great crested newts? So this in some ways is even more of an issue because, as I say, it's a fully protected species, it's widespread and it frequently comes into conflict with development. About 10 years ago we did some sums on how much traditional mitigation was costing on an annual basis, and we worked out it was something between 20 and 43 million pounds a year spent on traditional mitigation for this species. At DICE we do a lot of work on human-wildlife conflict, or human-wildlife coexistence I think we're meant to call it here, and we talk a lot about elephants and tigers. I often say that the crested newt is arguably the most costly human-wildlife conflict in the world. I'm not sure the others will be costed in the same way. Development mitigation of the great crested newts, well, it does involve not just translocation. In fact, there's probably relatively few projects that actually involve translocation. It does involve things like fencing off sites to stop newts moving onto the development footprint. It can involve some habitat restoration and enhancement, but it can mean that what you end up with is quite a nice pond surrounded by a bit of a habitat in the middle of a housing estate. And this type of issue you can illustrate here. One thing that we know about great crested newts is that they do operate on what we call a metapopulation system. Their whole viability is based around dispersal between ponds. So here we've got an ideal situation where we've got 5 nice ponds with dispersal routes between them. If you get traditional mitigation happening, it can happen something like this. So the ponds are retained, habitat in the vicinity of the ponds might actually be enhanced, but ultimately, if you look at the way that's been designed, these 5 ponds all become completely isolated. And the long-term viability of that situation, even if you created and enhanced it to crested newt heaven, is probably low, because these are now totally isolated sites and fragmented habitat. So with Brett Lewis, another PhD student and research assistant a few years ago, we decided to do a similar thing as we've done with reptiles. We tried to do some follow-up work on actual mitigation sites. And here are 12 sites where we had historical data. And these were sites that were the mitigations carried out before 2004. And so these actually had the opportunity of using the 2001 guidelines. And we had data on population assessments before any development, before any mitigation carried out. And these population assessments were carried out by the consultants using a combination of bottle trapping, simple traps out and catching newts, and going out at night and counting the number that you see. You can use those data to come up with these simple population indices for small, medium or large, depending on the numbers that you actually count. And I should say that it's arguable actually what these sort of counts mean, but for the purposes that we're going to use here, I'm going to use them. So all of these 12 sites were classified as small, medium or large before the mitigation happened. We went back a few years later to do some repeat surveys in 2012 and 2013 to see how these sites were getting on. And to summarise it, I've added this column here. So with apologies to anyone that's slightly colourblind, the red arrows that point down indicate the populations that are in decline. The skull and crossbones indicates those that went extinct. Green upward arrows indicate those that have been increasing, and the yellow arrows are those that are stable. And I think just looking at that column, you can see the overall trend is one of decline and possible extinction following those mitigation actions. So, anything we can do about it? Well, the fundamental problem with traditional mitigation actions is that they've been really focused on single sites with very little attention paid to the wider landscape that's going on around them. And then we know that the wider landscape is very important. So we have sat down with government agencies and discussed how we might move towards a more landscape level approach that might be more effective. And what is now being implemented is a new approach that involves environmental DNA analysis to look at distribution in the landscape. I'll just mention a little bit more about that in the middle, and then combining those data with GIS and species distribution modelling to produce what we call risk maps for local planning authorities to do their planning on or taking into account requested new distribution and predicted distribution. So environmental DNA, so here we have a photograph of one of our other speakers who's coming up later on, but in a previous life, I think as you can see, when she was an active member of the G1 Appreciation Society. But here we have, as I'm sitting here, I'm releasing my DNA all over this computer and into this room along this lectern. And all organisms give off tiny fragments of DNA into their environment. Ponds are great because ponds have a whole diversity of organisms releasing tiny bits of their DNA into the water to create what we might call the DNA soup. And you can take a sample of water like that, and it'd be absolutely fantastic if you do what Gail's doing here and look at some water and go, I can see crested newt, and I can see spider gib. It's a little bit more complicated than that. What you have to do is take that to a lab, you have to probe it with the target DNA that you're interested in, amplify it, but you can then detect very low levels of the target species. And in fact, great crested newts have been pioneering species for developing this technique. And Natural England now have, I think it's over 6,000 ponds in England that have been surveyed using environmental DNA for presence absence. So it's a way of getting data at a landscape scale that doesn't involve long nights carrying traps and nets around and things like that. So you take those eDNA records, you can combine them with other records, you then take them into your GIS system and you overlay those with things like landscape level data, habitat data, climatic data, and you get a nice pretty map of the crested newt distribution within a given area. You can then look at that and say, right, I'm now going to allocate risk zones, and the higher risk zones will be those where there's predicted high densities of newts, and the low risk zones will be those where there's very unlikely to be used. So this is a risk map for the West Midland planning authorities, where we're going from white zones, which are very, very low risk, practically no crested newts up to there, up to black, which are completely no-go zones. Those are SACs or treble size or nature reserves. And the red and amber zones are those that have relatively high suitability, and green and the white relatively low suitability. So the planning authority looks at that, and when the developer comes along and says, I want to do development there, you look to see where it is. And the developer, instead of paying someone to put miles of drift fences around, do nights and nights of surveying, will be told, well, you've got to pay this amount of compensation according to the impact that will happen according to our risk map. That compensation payment goes into a pot of money that is then used to create new ponds and new habitats that are strategically located in what we call strategic opportunity areas. So again, the species distribution model is used to identify the optimum locations for those ponds. So this means that there's actually no hold-up for the developers. They haven't got to do lots and lots of surveys because they're using maps to determine where the likelihood of crested newts are paid compensation accordingly. And this falls within what we call district level licensing, which is now being rolled out across England. So going forward, what can we do about the widespread reptiles? Well, there's some evidence that penning or doing a soft release, which involves trying to reduce the immediate dispersal of animals that have been put in bags, put in a car, released somewhere else, they're going to be pretty stressed out, just scattering when they're left. And so this may be worth considering. There's some other work that we've done on this that I haven't had time to talk about that suggests that may work for some of these species. The other thing that we need to do is really improve our monitoring protocols. Our monitoring protocols have really not moved on in about 20 or 30 years. And unfortunately, the lack of guidance and the lack of use of evidence permeating monitoring protocols is a massive issue. And I think this is something that we need to try and bring up to date. There's lots of work that's been going on that we can apply to developing better protocols and ultimately better decision making. For great crested newts, there's already some encouraging news. Although it's only been running about 5 years, over 2,000 new ponds have been created for crested newts. Admittedly, some ponds have been lost as well, but the goal is usually to try and create new ponds at a rate of 4 to 1 or at least 8 to 1. Not all of those ponds will be colonised. So there's a lot more new ponds being created than have actually been lost. And this is a much more joined up landscape level approach for great crested newts. But as I say, I think it's early days yet, and it's really very much watch this space for longer term outcomes. So do development mitigation translocations work? I spend a lot of time talking to government agencies, NGOs and planners about things like, well, how long is this going to take? How much monitoring do we need to do? And I have to say that I often see pictures of despair on their face when I say, well, you probably need 30 years to fully understand what's actually going on. And I think one of the fundamental things that we have to wrestle with is really how we get a compromise between the ecological realities of understanding long-term population dynamics within the sort of time frames that decisions need to be made. But either way, I think the way forward is to start our surveys as soon as we can, and as when we're as young as possible, and for carrying on as actually long as possible. So perhaps in 20 years or so, I may look something like this. I probably have students that think I already look rather like this. And to answer that fundamental question, do development mitigation translocations work? If you invite me back to Birdwise in 2050, I might be able to give you more of a definitive answer. So with that, just thanks to a lot of people for a big team effort. There's a whole range of people being involved with this. Darren Nash, I think, is hiding at the back of that photo somewhere. Brett Lewis looks as though he's disappeared to the bar, but there's quite a few other people involved there as well. Thank you to the various organisations that have helped support and fund it, and thank you for coming along today and being patient with the talk about reptiles. And that's it. I've just been talking bang on time.
Just before Richard jumps down off the stage, has anyone got any questions? Yes.
We haven't done any genetics on those at all. There is genetic work on other populations, and there is some evidence that you can go through bottlenecks. And if you translocate a very small number of animals, they will go through a population bottleneck. I didn't have time to talk about Bus Company Island, but I think that's what happened there. We transplanted 103 slow worms. A lot of them died, and we ended up with a tiny population of about 30 that then started to breed and is slowly tipping over. Again, we haven't done any genetic analysis on that, but probably genetic bottlenecking when you do transplantations may well be an issue.
Are there any fitness of species that are in the time of their transplantation?
Yeah, we actually did that with the slow worms at Bus Company Island. We measured body condition, and we found that the animals that were translocated had lower body condition than those in other natural populations, and that body condition declined for the first 2 years. So I think they were stressed out for about 2 years. After that, they went through the bottleneck, and those that got through that period, the body condition improved.
But there also any change to their reproductive success after transplantation?
Yeah, again, Bus Company Island, there was no reproduction for 2 years. We found no juveniles at all. After that, they pulled through, and then juveniles started coming through. So there was this period of, I think, stress establishment. And I think what might happen in some other populations where you don't have 103 animals is that they won't pull through that and they'll go extinct. And that may well happen. If they get through that period, they stabilise, then the population can increase again.
That's one, yeah.
It's being done within the district level licensing scheme. I think it's being done every 5 years, which I think corresponds to when the new land cover maps come out. And I think they're coming out for remodelling those. If I'm honest, I don't think, as far as the use is concerned, that much will change over that period. So 5 years is good, but the reality is probably you can leave it longer than that. But I think that's a good idea to start with. There is a pond layer as well that is used to update it, but there's issues over what you call the pond. How big is the water body, the environment, and those sorts of things.
So I'm going to cut the questions up there, but I believe Richard's hanging around for a bit longer for the next break, so you can